Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about the seven chakras, a journey within. Have you ever had a day when everything just felt wrong? Not because something terrible happened, not because you were sick, but deep inside something felt off. Like a machine that is running but not running well, like a song that is being played but one note is out of tune. And then on another day everything felt just right. You felt calm, you felt strong, you felt like you could face anything. Your words came out clearly, your heart felt open, your mind felt sharp. Most of us have had both kinds of days, and most of us have wondered why, what makes the difference. For thousands of years, people in many parts of the world have had an answer to that question. And that answer, that old and beautiful idea, is what we are going to explore together today. This is the story of the seven chakras. The word chakra comes from an ancient language called Sanskrit, one of the oldest languages in the world, from the land of India. In that language, chakra simply means wheel, a spinning wheel, a circle of energy. According to very old spiritual traditions, teachings that have been passed down for thousands of years, the human body is not just bones and blood and muscles. There is also, these traditions say, a kind of invisible energy that flows through us. Like a river running through the body, and along this river there are seven special centers, seven spinning wheels of energy, and each one of these centers is connected to different parts of our lives, our feelings, our health, our thoughts, our relationships, our confidence, our love, our purpose. These seven centers are the seven chakras. Now, it is important to say this clearly and honestly from the beginning. Chakras are not something that modern science has been able to measure or prove in a laboratory. You cannot see them on an X-ray. You cannot find them in a medical textbook. They belong to the world of traditional spiritual belief, the way that many people have understood the human experience for a very, very long time. And yet millions of people around the world, from India to America, from Japan to Brazil, from small villages to large cities, find this idea deeply meaningful. They say that when they learn about the chakras, they understand themselves better, they feel more at peace. They make better choices, they become kinder to themselves and to the people around them. So today, we are not here to say that chakras are scientifically proven facts, but we are also not here to dismiss them as silly or useless. We are here to understand them, to explore them with an open heart and an open mind. By the end of this documentary, you will know what each chakra is, where it is believed to be in the body, what it is thought to influence, and how ordinary people just like you, use this ancient wisdom in their daily lives. Let us begin. To understand where the idea of chakras comes from, we need to travel back in time, very far back, more than 3,000 years ago, and some scholars believe even longer ago than that. In the land of ancient India, there were teachers, thinkers, and seekers. These were people who spent their lives trying to understand the deepest questions. Who are we? Why do we suffer? How can we live well? What is the nature of the human being? These ancient teachers did not have computers or laboratories. But they had something very powerful. They had time, they had silence, and they had the practice of deep inner observation, sitting still, breathing slowly, turning their attention inward, and watching carefully what happened inside the human body and mind. Over many generations, these observations were written down in a collection of ancient texts. The most important of these are called the Vedas and the Upanishads. These are among the oldest written spiritual texts in the world. And within these texts, there are descriptions of something called prana, which means life force or life energy. The idea that a kind of invisible energy fills the body and keeps us alive. Later, another set of teachings called the Tantric tradition, which began roughly 1500 years ago, gave us a more detailed map of this energy. This is where the idea of the seven chakras became clear and organized. Teachers described exactly where these energy centers were located, what colors they were associated with, what qualities they held, and how they could be worked with through practices like yoga, meditation, and breathing exercises. The word yoga itself, which many people today know as a form of exercise, originally meant something much deeper. It meant union, the joining together of the body, mind, and spirit, and the chakras were a central part of this understanding. From India, these ideas traveled. Along trade routes, through traveling teachers, through books and conversations, the idea of energy centers in the body found its way to other cultures. Some people say they see similar ideas in Chinese medicine, the concept of qi, or life energy flowing through channels called meridians. Some see echoes in ancient Egyptian thought. Some find it in certain Christian mystical traditions, in Islamic Sufi teaching, in Japanese healing arts. The names are different, the maps are different. But the basic idea that human beings have an inner life, an energy life that affects everything about them, this idea appears again and again across human history, in many places, among many peoples. In the modern world, the idea of chakras arrived in the West mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries, brought by Indian teachers and scholars. In recent decades, it has become very well known, not just among spiritual seekers, but among yoga practitioners, therapists, artists, healers, and ordinary people looking for a framework to understand their inner lives. Today, the seven chakra system is one of the most widely recognized spiritual frameworks in the world. So what exactly is a chakra? Let us try to understand this with a very simple image. Imagine a river. This river flows through your body from the base of your spine all the way to the top of your head. This river carries the life energy, the force that keeps you alive, keeps you feeling, keeps you thinking. Now along this river there are seven special places, seven pools if you like, where the energy collects and spins, like a whirlpool in a river, and each of these whirlpools is connected to different organs, different emotions, different qualities of life. When the river flows freely and the whirlpools spin in a healthy, balanced way, you feel well, you feel grounded, you feel loving, you feel confident, you feel creative, you feel clear. But sometimes things happen in life, stress, fear, grief, old pain, difficult relationships, unhealthy habits, and one of those whirlpools starts to slow down or become blocked. The energy does not flow as it should, and according to this tradition, that is when problems can arise, physical discomfort. Emotional difficulty, confusion, disconnection from yourself and others. Think of it like a garden hose. When water flows freely through it, everything is fine. But if you put your foot on the hose at one point, the water cannot flow past that point. Everything beyond that point gets too little water. The garden begins to suffer. The chakras are like checkpoints along the hose, and the practice of working with chakras through breathing, movement, meditation, positive habits is like removing your foot from the hose. Allowing the water to flow freely again. This is the basic idea, simple but very deep. Now let us meet each of the seven chakras one by one. We will start at the very bottom, at the base of the spine, and we will travel upward, all the way to the top of the head. This journey from the bottom to the top is itself symbolic. It represents the journey from our most basic animal needs, the need for safety, for food, for shelter, all the way up to our highest human qualities, wisdom, connection to something greater than ourselves, spiritual awareness. Each step of this journey is important. You cannot skip the lower steps and stand securely on the higher ones. A tree needs roots before it can have branches, so let us begin with the roots. The first chakra is called Muladhara in Sanskrit. Most people simply call it the root chakra. It is located at the very base of the spine, at the tailbone, the bottom of the backbone. Some traditions also associate it with the area between the legs. The traditional color of the root chakra is red, deep, earthy red. The color of soil, of clay, of the ground beneath our feet, and that is exactly what this chakra is about. The ground, the foundation, the very first and most basic need that every living creature has, the need to feel safe. The need to feel that you belong somewhere, that you have a place in the world, that the earth beneath your feet will hold you. Think about a child. The very first thing a child needs is not education, not entertainment, not adventure. The very first thing a child needs is to feel safe, to feel held, to feel that there is someone who will take care of them. Without that foundation, nothing else can grow properly. The root chakra is that foundation for all of us. Not just as children, but throughout our lives. According to these traditional teachings, when the root chakra is in a healthy, balanced state, a person feels stable. They feel secure. They are not constantly afraid. They can handle the normal difficulties of life without falling apart. They feel connected to their body, to their family, to their community, to the earth itself. They have what some teachers call groundedness, like a tree with deep roots that can bend in the wind without falling over. Many people today feel a lack of this grounding. And it makes sense why. We live in a fast, uncertain world. Many people have moved far from where they were born. Many have lost jobs or homes. Many have grown up in families where they did not feel fully safe or cared for. The fears of modern life can keep the energy of the root chakra in a constant state of stress. When this chakra is believed to be out of balance, people may feel restless, anxious, constantly worried about money or security. They may feel like they do not belong anywhere. Like they are always waiting for something bad to happen. They may have trouble finishing things they start, always moving but never settling. Some may feel disconnected from their body, spending all their time in their thoughts, never quite present. On the physical side, some believers associate the root chakra with the legs, feet, lower back, and the immune system, the body's ability to protect itself. Let us meet someone who might show us what this looks like in real life. Imagine a man named Ibrahim. He grew up in a small village. At 40 years old, he moved to a big city for work. Suddenly, everything that made him feel safe was gone. His family was far away. The food was different. The sounds were different. He did not know anyone. He began to feel anxious all the time, afraid of losing his job, afraid of the future, afraid of getting sick. He could not sleep well. He felt tense in his body, especially in his lower back. He felt, as he described it, like a tree that had been pulled out of the ground. From a chakra perspective, someone might say that Ibrahim's root chakra needs attention, and what might help. Teachers of this tradition often suggest things that reconnect a person to the earth and to the body: walking barefoot on grass or soil, gardening, putting your hands in the earth, eating simple, nourishing food. Establishing a regular daily routine, waking up at the same time, eating at regular times, because routine creates a feeling of safety and predictability. Spending time in nature, being with people you trust, gentle physical exercise. Simply sitting still and feeling the weight of your body on the chair or the ground. These are not magical solutions. They are simple, practical acts of returning to the earth. Of reminding the nervous system, the part of the body that manages fear and safety, that you are okay, that you are here, that the ground is solid beneath you. We move now up the body just a few inches above the root chakra to the lower belly, below the navel, in the area of the pelvis and the hips. This is the second chakra, called Svadhisthana in Sanskrit. We call it the Sacral Chakra. The word sacral comes from the word sacred, and indeed, many traditions see this part of the body as holding something very precious and important. The traditional color of the Sacral Chakra is orange, warm, flowing, vibrant orange, the color of sunsets and fire and ripe fruit. If the root chakra is about survival, about having what you need to live, then the Sacral Chakra is about truly living, about enjoying life, about feeling. This chakra is believed to be the home of our emotions, our creativity, our pleasure, and our connection to other people. It is the part of us that reaches out toward others, that wants to create, that wants to experience the joy and beauty of life. Think about a young child. Once they feel safe, what do? They play, they dance, they draw. They reach for the people they love, they laugh, they feel things deeply and fully. That beautiful, free, expressive energy, that is the energy of the Sacral Chakra at its most natural. When this chakra is believed to be flowing well, a person feels emotionally alive. They enjoy their relationships. They feel creative, not necessarily as a famous artist, but in the sense that they find joy in making things, in expressing themselves, in the little pleasures of daily life. They can feel their feelings without being overwhelmed by them. They move through emotions the way water moves, feeling them, and then letting them pass. But when this energy is blocked or out of balance, a person may feel emotionally numb, unable to feel much joy or connection. Or the opposite, they may be overwhelmed by emotions, swinging from sadness to anger to fear with no sense of control. They may lose their creativity, feeling dried up or uninspired. They may have difficulty in relationships, either pulling away from people out of fear or clinging too tightly out of need. Let us think about a woman named Amara. She was once a joyful, creative person who loved painting and spending time with friends. But after a painful experience, a difficult breakup, a loss in the family, she slowly withdrew. She stopped painting, she stopped going out. She told herself she was just being practical, but inside she had closed a door. She had shut down her feelings to protect herself from getting hurt again. From a chakra perspective, her sacral chakra had, in a sense, gone quiet. People who work with chakra teachings might suggest that Amara find gentle ways to reconnect with pleasure and creativity. Not grand gestures, but small ones: cooking a meal with care, listening to music that she loves, picking up a paintbrush even if just for 10 minutes. Spending time near water. The sacral chakra is often associated with the element of water, with flow and movement. Dancing even alone in a room, allowing herself to feel what she feels without judging it. The sacral chakra teaches us that life is not only about surviving, it is also about experiencing, feeling, creating, connecting. We rise now to the area of the upper belly, around the stomach, below the ribs, in the place people often call the solar plexus. You can find it just above your belly button, in the soft hollow at the center of your torso. This is the third chakra, called Manipura in Sanskrit. We call it the solar plexus chakra. The word solar means relating to the sun, and the traditional color of this chakra is bright, brilliant yellow, like the sun itself. If the root chakra is about safety and the sacral chakra is about feeling, the solar plexus chakra is about power. Not power over others, but power within yourself. This chakra is believed to be the seat of your personal will, your confidence, your sense of identity. It is where your I am lives, the part of you that knows who you are, what you stand for, what you are capable of. Do you know that feeling in your stomach when you are about to do something courageous? When you are about to speak up in a difficult situation or try something new and uncertain? That sensation, that tightening, that flutter happens right there in the solar plexus area. The body itself seems to know that something important is happening. When the solar plexus chakra is believed to be in balance, a person has healthy confidence. Not arrogance, not the loud, aggressive kind of confidence that puts others down, but the quiet, steady kind, the kind that says, I know what I believe, I know what I value. I can handle what comes my way. These are people who take responsibility for their lives. They make decisions without being paralyzed by fear. They do not give their power away easily. When this energy is believed to be weak or blocked, a person may struggle with low self-worth. They may constantly feel that they are not good enough. They may have trouble making decisions, always second-guessing themselves. They may allow others to control them because deep down they do not believe in their own value. They may be easily manipulated, easily criticized into giving up. Some may feel the opposite, overcompensating for their inner insecurity by becoming controlling, domineering, bullying others. Think about a young man named Carlos. He was always bright and capable, but grew up being told that he was not smart enough, not strong enough, not good enough. By the time he was an adult, he found it almost impossible to speak up for himself. He would agree with people even when he disagreed, just to avoid conflict. He would give up on his own dreams before he even tried, certain he would fail. He had the ability but not the belief. His inner flame had been dimmed. From a chakra perspective, Carlos needs to rekindle his solar plexus energy. What might that look like? Setting a small goal and completing it, because every completed goal tells the inner self that you are capable. Practicing standing tall, literally, because the body and the mind speak to each other. Spending time in sunlight, engaging in activities that make you feel competent and skilled. Learning to say no when you mean no and yes when you mean yes. Being honest with yourself about what you actually want, not just what you think you are allowed to want. This chakra is also associated with the digestive system. Many people notice that their stomach is one of the first places in the body where they feel stress or anxiety. I have butterflies in my stomach. My gut is telling me something is wrong. The language we use every day points to this deep connection between the belly and our sense of self and safety. We arrive now at the center of the chest, at the heart. This is the fourth chakra, Anahata in Sanskrit. We call it the heart chakra. And its color is green, the green of growing things, of spring, of life renewing itself. The heart chakra is the middle chakra. There are 3 below it and 3 above it. It is the bridge, the crossing point. The place where the earthly and the spiritual, the body and the spirit, the self and the other all come together. This chakra is believed to be the home of love, not romantic love alone, though that is part of it, but all forms of love. Love for your children, your parents, your friends, love for strangers, love for yourself. Compassion, which means the ability to feel what others feel and to care about their well-being. Forgiveness, the willingness to let go of old pain and open your heart again. If the lower 3 chakras are about building a strong self, being safe, being alive, being confident, then the heart chakra is about opening that self to others, about recognizing that we are not islands, that we need each other. That love is not a weakness, but perhaps the greatest human strength. When the heart chakra is believed to be open and flowing, a person gives and receives love freely. They have warm, genuine relationships. They can forgive not because they pretend the hurt never happened, but because they choose not to carry it forever. They care about others' well-being without losing themselves. They feel gratitude. They notice beauty. They are gentle with others and with themselves. When this energy is believed to be closed or blocked, a person may find it very hard to let others in. They may keep everyone at a distance, afraid of being hurt. They may have difficulty forgiving. They may feel lonely even when surrounded by people. They may be overly critical of others or of themselves. Some may give love too desperately, without boundaries, losing themselves in the needs of others. Think about an older woman named Fatima. Many years ago, someone she loved very deeply betrayed her trust. And she made a decision, maybe not a conscious one, but a decision of the heart, to never be that vulnerable again. Over the years, she became more and more closed. Her friendships grew distant. Her children said she seemed cold. She told herself she was just being strong, but inside she was lonely and sad, and she did not understand why. From a chakra perspective, Fatima's heart had been protected for so long that it had become imprisoned. What might help someone like Fatima? Teachers of this tradition often suggest practices of loving kindness, a form of meditation where you sit quietly and in your mind send warmth and goodwill to yourself and to others, not forcing it. Just gently practicing the direction of love, the way you might exercise a muscle that has not been used in a long time. Journaling about gratitude, writing down, every day, a few things you are grateful for, because gratitude opens the heart like sunlight opens a flower. Spending time with children or animals who offer simple, uncomplicated love, and most importantly, practicing self-compassion, treating yourself with the same kindness you might offer a dear friend. The heart chakra reminds us that to truly love others, we must first be willing to love ourselves. Not in a selfish or arrogant way, but in the gentle, accepting way of a good parent who looks at their child and says, "You are enough, you are worthy, you are loved." We rise now from the chest to the throat. The fifth chakra is called Vishuddha in Sanskrit. We call it the throat chakra. Its color is blue, the clear, open blue of a summer sky or a calm sea. The throat chakra is the center of communication, of voice, of truth. This chakra is believed to govern how we express ourselves, not only in the words we speak, but also in how we listen, in how we write, in how we create through sound and song. It is the part of us that wants to be heard. That needs to say what is true, that must speak its own name. Have you ever had something important to say and found yourself unable to say it? You know exactly what you want to express, but the words will not come out. Or they come out wrong, too harsh, or too weak, or not at all. Many people have experienced this, standing in front of someone and going completely silent, feeling a tightness in the throat, a closing, as if the words are locked inside. When the throat chakra is believed to be balanced, a person speaks with clarity and honesty. They say what they mean and they mean what they say. They can tell their truth even in difficult conversations. They are also good listeners. They hear others not just to respond, but to understand. They express their creativity through their voice in whatever form that takes, whether speaking, writing, singing, or teaching. When this chakra is believed to be out of balance, a person may be unable to express themselves. They may constantly hold back, swallowing their feelings and their truth. They may fear speaking in public, even in small groups. They may agree with others just to avoid the discomfort of disagreement. Or the opposite, they may speak too much, too harshly, without thought. They may gossip or lie. They may use their voice as a weapon rather than a bridge. Think about a girl named Priya. She grew up in a home where children were taught to be quiet, speak only when spoken to. Her opinions were rarely asked for, and when she offered them, they were dismissed. By the time she was an adult, she had a constant feeling of being invisible. She had powerful ideas and deep feelings, but almost never shared them. At work, when she had an important insight, she stayed silent and watched others get the credit for ideas she had whispered to herself, but never said aloud. From a chakra perspective, Priya's throat chakra needs to be gently encouraged to open. What might help, beginning with small acts of honest expression, writing in a journal, letting the words out on paper first where it feels safer. Singing even alone, because singing is one of the purest and most natural ways to open the throat. Practicing speaking the truth in low-stakes situations, saying, "Actually, I prefer this," or "I think I see it differently" in everyday conversations, voice exercises, humming. And perhaps most powerfully, finding people who genuinely want to hear what you have to say, because the throat opens most naturally in the presence of real listening. The throat chakra also reminds us of the responsibility that comes with voice. The things we say have power. They can build up or tear down, they can heal or harm. The throat chakra is not just about speaking, it is about speaking with integrity, saying what is true, saying what is kind when possible, and what is necessary when kindness must step aside. We rise now to the area between and slightly above the eyebrows, the space that many people point to without even knowing why when they talk about looking within or seeing clearly. This is the sixth chakra, called Ajna in Sanskrit. We call it the third eye chakra. Its color is a deep, rich indigo, a dark blue-purple, the color of the deep sky just before full night. The third eye chakra is the center of insight, of inner knowing, of intuition. Intuition is a word that means knowing something without being able to fully explain how you know it. A feeling that something is right or wrong before the mind has had time to think it through. A sense of understanding that goes beyond what the eyes can see or the ears can hear. Almost everyone has experienced intuition. A mother who knows something is wrong with her child before any symptoms appear. A traveler who feels uneasy about a path and chooses a different one. A person who meets someone and immediately, without reason, feels deep trust or deep warning. These moments of knowing without knowing how, this is the territory of the third eye. According to traditional teachings, the third eye chakra is also associated with imagination, with the ability to see the bigger picture, with wisdom that comes from reflection rather than just from experience. It is about seeing beyond what is immediately obvious, about understanding the deeper meaning of things. When this chakra is believed to be open and clear, a person has strong inner clarity. They have good judgment. They can see through confusion and find the heart of a situation. They have a rich inner life full of imagination and reflection. They are able to learn from their experiences rather than simply repeating the same mistakes. They listen to their gut feelings and find that those feelings are often right. When this chakra is believed to be blocked or overactive, a person may feel confused, unable to make decisions, unable to see a clear path forward. They may be overly analytical, thinking too much and trusting nothing. Or in the other direction, they may become ungrounded, lost in fantasies and illusions, disconnected from practical reality. They may be closed-minded, refusing to consider any perspective other than their own. Think about an older man named Quame. He was a farmer who had worked the same land for 40 years. He knew his land the way he knew his own hands. He could look at the sky and feel the weather coming. He could look at a plant and know whether it was healthy or sick. He did not call this spiritual. He would have laughed if someone told him about chakras. But the quiet intelligence he had developed through years of patient observation, the deep knowing that came from within, that, a chakra teacher might say, was his third eye working beautifully. The third eye does not always announce itself with dramatic visions. For most people, it speaks quietly, a gentle nudge, a small voice, a feeling. The practice of developing third eye awareness is, for most people, simply the practice of learning to be quiet enough to hear it. What supports the third eye chakra? Practices of stillness and reflection, meditation, even 5 or 10 minutes of sitting quietly each day, keeping a dream journal because many people find that their dreams carry messages from the deeper self, spending time in nature without distractions. Asking yourself honest questions and sitting with the answers rather than rushing past them. Reading, learning, expanding your understanding of the world, and perhaps most importantly, learning to trust yourself, to believe that you have wisdom within you and that if you are still enough, you can access it. We arrive at last at the very top, the crown of the head. The seventh chakra is called Sahasrara in Sanskrit. We call it the crown chakra. Its color is violet, a deep, luminous purple, and in some traditions it is associated with pure white light, like sunlight containing all colors at once. The crown chakra is the highest of the 7. And it is about the most expansive thing that human beings have ever reached for connection to something greater than themselves. Different people describe this differently, according to their own beliefs and traditions. For some, it is a connection to God. For others, it is a sense of unity with all of life, with other human beings, with nature, with the universe itself. For others still, it is simply the experience of deep peace, of profound awareness, of feeling that life has meaning and that we are part of something larger than our individual story. You do not need to be religious to have experienced a touch of crown chakra energy. Most people have in moments that seem to come out of nowhere and are impossible to fully describe. A moment standing at the edge of the ocean at sunset, feeling very small and very peaceful at the same time. A moment holding a newborn child and being overwhelmed by a sense of wonder. A moment in the middle of a piece of music that makes something inside you go completely still. A moment at the bedside of someone dying, feeling the immense mystery of existence pressing close. In those moments, the ordinary boundaries of the self seem to dissolve a little. The small worries and the endless to-do lists fall away, and there is, just briefly, a sense of being part of something vast and beautiful and real. This is the territory of the crown chakra. When this chakra is believed to be open and flowing, a person feels a deep sense of meaning and connection. They may not be wealthy or powerful in the world's terms, but they feel rich inside. They have a sense of purpose. They feel grateful. They experience moments of genuine peace, not the peace of having no problems, but the peace that exists beneath the problems. They are able to hold their own individual life within a larger perspective. They do not take themselves too seriously, because they understand that they are one small, precious part of an unimaginably large whole. When this energy is believed to be blocked, a person may feel spiritually lost. Not necessarily in a religious sense. They may feel that life has no meaning, that they are alone, that nothing they do matters. They may feel cut off from any sense of the sacred. They may be consumed by material concerns, unable to feel wonder or awe. Or on the other extreme, they may become so focused on spiritual matters that they lose touch with practical, earthly life, forgetting that the 7 chakras begin with the root, with the earth, with the very basic needs of human existence. Think about an elderly woman named May. She had lived a very hard life, she had lost people she loved, she had known real poverty. And yet those who knew her said there was something luminous about her. She had a quality of peace that made people calm just by being near her. She was not rich. She was not famous, she had not traveled the world, but she had lived deeply. She had prayed in her simple way, she had been kind to people. And somewhere along the way she had found what can only be called wisdom, a settled knowing that life, for all its pain, was a gift. From a chakra perspective, May had found her crown, what supports the crown chakra. Any practice that opens us to something beyond the individual self, prayer if prayer is meaningful to you, meditation, spending time in silence, being in nature, acts of deep generosity, giving without any expectation of return, letting go of the need to control everything, practicing gratitude. Reading the wisdom of traditions other than your own, and simply living with awareness, paying attention to your life, noticing the miracle of being here at all. The crown chakra does not need to be sought in grand spiritual experiences. It can be found in the smallest moments of genuine presence. Now let us bring all of this down from the mountaintop and into the valley of ordinary life. Because the chakras, whether you believe in them literally or simply find them a useful way to think about yourself, are not just for monks in caves or yogis on mountains. They are for everyone, for the mother raising children, for the young man starting his first job, for the couple trying to understand each other, for the person sitting alone at night wondering who they are and why they feel the way they feel. Let us think about how the 7 chakras show up in everyday life. In family relationships, we can see all 7 chakras at work. Think about a parent and a child. The root chakra is at play when the child needs to feel safe, and the parent needs to provide that safety, not through perfection, but through consistency and presence. I am here, you are okay. When that root level safety is disrupted by poverty, by conflict in the home, by the loss of a parent, the effects can last for decades. Not because the person is broken, but because that foundation needs to be rebuilt slowly and patiently. The sacral chakra is at work when families play together, celebrate together, tell stories, cook meals with joy rather than duty. The warmth of family feeling, the laughter, the tenderness, the shared pleasure of simply being together, this is sacral energy at its most natural. The solar plexus chakra is at work when children are encouraged to develop a healthy sense of self. When they are allowed to have opinions, to make small decisions, to discover what they are good at. Parents who constantly criticize, or on the other hand, parents who do everything for their children without letting them try, both, in different ways, can make it harder for that child's inner fire to burn clearly. The heart chakra is at work in every act of love between family members, in forgiveness after conflict, in the willingness to say, I was wrong, or I am sorry, in the daily small acts of care that say, without words, you matter to me. The throat chakra is at work in family communication, in the ability to talk honestly about difficult things, to listen without immediately defending, to say hard truths with gentleness. The third eye is at work when parents trust their intuition about their children, when they sense that something is wrong before the child says anything, or when a child begins to develop their own judgment, their own sense of right and wrong, their own inner wisdom. And the crown chakra is at work in the moments when families remember what they are really to each other, beyond the conflicts and the dishes in the sink and the unmet expectations, in the moments of pure love that transcend the everyday. The same could be said of friendships, of work relationships, of romantic partnerships. Confidence, solar plexus, is what allows someone to walk into a job interview and speak clearly, what allows a person to start a business despite uncertainty, what allows someone to leave a situation that is harming them, even when it is scary. Communication, throat, is what allows a friendship to survive a misunderstanding, what allows a couple to navigate conflict without destroying each other, what allows a teacher to truly reach a student who is struggling. Decision-making draws on the third eye, that inner knowing, that sense of which path feels right, even when neither choice is perfect. Emotional health runs through the whole system, the groundedness of the root, the aliveness of the sacral, the self-worth of the solar plexus, the love of the heart. All of these together create what we might call emotional well-being. And personal growth is in many ways the journey of working through all 7 chakras, of building a stronger foundation, of feeling more fully alive, of knowing yourself more clearly, of loving more openly, of expressing yourself more truly, of seeing more deeply, of touching now and then that great sense of peace and belonging that the crown chakra points toward. Now, let us talk honestly about some common misunderstandings, because when something becomes very popular, as chakras have in recent years, misunderstandings tend to multiply. The first misunderstanding is that chakras are a religion, or that believing in chakras means you must belong to a certain faith. This is not true. The chakra system originated in Hindu and Tantric spiritual traditions, and those roots deserve respect. But many people who work with chakras are not Hindu. They are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, or they belong to no religion at all. They use chakras as a framework for understanding their inner life, not as a religious doctrine. The ideas about self-awareness, emotional health, and personal growth that the chakra system points to are universal human themes that appear in every culture. The second misunderstanding is that chakras are scientifically proven. They are not. Modern science has not been able to identify chakras through any physical measurement. The chakra system is a traditional spiritual teaching, not a medical fact. It should not be used as a substitute for medical care. If you are unwell, physically or mentally, please see a doctor or a qualified mental health professional. Chakra work can be a meaningful supplement to your well-being, but it is not a replacement for proper care. The third misunderstanding is that someone can look at you and immediately tell you that one of your chakras is blocked and then sell you something to fix it. Be careful here. While there are many sincere, knowledgeable teachers and practitioners of chakra work in the world, there are also those who use spiritual language to manipulate or profit from people's vulnerability. Wisdom about the chakras is something that develops slowly through self-reflection and genuine practice. It is not something that can be delivered instantly by a stranger for a fee. The fourth misunderstanding is that once you have opened all your chakras, you will be perfect and have no more problems. This is not how any tradition describes it. The chakra system is not a destination but a journey, a lifelong process of becoming more aware, more balanced, more whole. Most teachers say that even the wisest and most developed human beings continue to work with all 7 chakras throughout their lives. The fifth misunderstanding is that the chakras are strange, exotic, or foreign to ordinary people. In truth, the qualities that each chakra represents, safety, creativity, confidence, love, honest communication, wisdom, spiritual connection, these are universal human needs and experiences. People have spoken about these things in every language, in every culture, for as long as human beings have existed. The chakra system is simply one particular map of this universal territory. A map is not the territory itself. Different cultures have different maps. All of them can be useful. The chakra system is one that millions of people have found deeply helpful for understanding their inner lives. Now, let us come to something very practical. Perhaps you have found something in this documentary that resonated with you. Perhaps you recognized yourself in one of the people we described, in Ibrahim's restlessness, or Amara's closed creativity, or Carlos's quiet lack of confidence, or Fatima's closed heart, or Priya's unspoken truth. Perhaps you simply want to take care of yourself a little better, to feel more balanced. More whole. Here's a simple daily routine, something that does not require special equipment, special knowledge, or a lot of time. Something that an ordinary person, anywhere in the world, can do every single day. Begin your morning with 5 minutes of simple, slow breathing. You do not need to learn any special technique. Just sit quietly in a chair, on the floor, wherever is comfortable. Close your eyes gently and breathe in slowly through your nose, counting to 4. Then breathe out slowly through your mouth, counting to 4. Do this several times. Feel your body in the chair or on the floor. Notice that the ground is holding you. This simple act, done every morning, begins to calm the nervous system. It speaks to the root chakra. It says, you are here, you are safe. The day can begin. As you go through your morning, before you step into the busyness of the day, take one moment to check in with yourself. Not for long, just a moment. How am I feeling today? Where in my body do I feel tension? Where do I feel ease? This simple habit of self-noticing is the beginning of wisdom. Most people go through entire days without ever pausing to ask themselves how they are. We are so busy responding to the world outside that we never tune in to the world inside. Move your body during the day. It does not need to be a long workout. A walk outside, especially somewhere with trees or grass or sky, is one of the simplest and most powerful things a human being can do for their well-being. Move your hips and your belly. This supports the sacral chakra energy. Stand tall and feel your feet on the ground. This supports the root and the solar plexus. eat with some attention and gratitude. Many traditions connect food and the act of eating to the lower chakras, to the earth, to the body, to life itself. Eating a meal slowly, noticing the taste, feeling grateful for having food, this is a small but real practice of grounding and presence. Speak kindly today. To others and to yourself. Every time you speak with honesty and warmth, you are doing throat chakra work. Every time you choose to say something encouraging rather than critical to a child, a friend, a stranger, or yourself in the mirror, you are doing heart chakra work. Do one small creative act today. Write a sentence in a journal, hum a tune, draw something even if it is just a doodle on a piece of paper, cook something with care. These small acts of creativity feed the sacral chakra, the life energy of pleasure and expression. Find one moment of stillness. One moment, it can be very brief, where you simply stop. Stop moving, stop thinking about the next thing, stop looking at a screen. Just be where you are, look at the sky, breathe, notice. This moment of stillness is where the third eye and the crown chakra breathe, where intuition has a chance to speak, where peace can touch you, even in the middle of a busy day. Before you sleep, spend a few minutes in quiet reflection. Think of 3 things from the day that you are grateful for. They do not need to be grand things: the warmth of the sun, a kind word from a stranger, a meal that tasted good, a child's laugh. Gratitude, practiced regularly, is one of the most powerful ways to shift how we feel about our lives. It does not change what happens to us, but it changes how we see what happens to us. And as you lie down to sleep, bring to mind one person, anyone, and in your heart wish them well, send them warmth. This small act of loving kindness, done silently before sleep, is heart chakra work of the simplest and most beautiful kind. That is all. 5 minutes of breathing in the morning, a moment of self-checking, movement during the day, kind speech, a small creative act, 1 moment of stillness, evening gratitude, a silent wish of goodwill, nothing magical, nothing complicated, just a gentle, daily habit of turning inward. Of treating yourself as someone worthy of attention and care, of moving through the world with a little more awareness than before. And now, let us take one last journey together, from the bottom to the top, one final visit to each of the 7 chakras. At the very base of the spine, red like deep earth, the root chakra, the foundation, safety, belonging, the reminder that before anything else, every human being needs to feel that they have a place in this world, that the ground will hold them. That they are not alone. Just above, orange like a warm fire, the sacral chakra, emotion, creativity, pleasure, the reminder that we are not here only to survive but to feel, to create, to connect, to experience the richness of being alive. At the upper belly, yellow like the sun, the solar plexus chakra, power, confidence, identity, the reminder that each of us has a self-worth, knowing and honoring, that we are capable, that we have the right to stand in our own light. At the center of the chest, green like new leaves, the heart chakra, love, compassion, forgiveness, the reminder that we are made for connection, that love in all its forms is perhaps the most important thing in a human life. And that the most important love to begin with is the love we offer ourselves. At the throat, blue like an open sky, the throat chakra, truth, voice, expression, the reminder that our words have power. That speaking honestly and listening genuinely are among the most important things we can do in our relationships. Between the eyebrows, deep indigo like the night sky, the third eye chakra, intuition, insight, inner knowing. The reminder that we each have a wisdom within us that goes beyond what we have been taught, that if we are quiet enough, we can hear it. And at the very top of the head, violet like the edge of the light, the crown chakra, connection, meaning. Peace, the reminder that we are part of something greater than our individual story, that life, even in its difficulty, is full of meaning, and that the deepest peace is available to all of us, not in the absence of struggle, but in the middle of it. 7 chakras. 7 aspects of the human being, 7 invitations to know yourself more fully, to live more freely, to love more openly. This is ancient wisdom. It has been held carefully, passed carefully, from teacher to student, from parent to child, from one generation to the next, for thousands of years. And it has survived this long because, for millions of people, it has carried something real, something true. You do not need to take any of it on faith. You do not need to believe in anything you cannot feel in your own experience. Simply try the small practices. Simply sit for 5 minutes with your breath. Simply pause and ask yourself how you are. Simply say the kind thing instead of the silent thing. Simply let yourself feel what you feel without rushing past it, and see what happens. The chakra system is, in the end, a map. And like any map, its value is not in the paper it is written on, but in how it helps you find your way. May this map serve you well. May you find your ground and your flow and your fire. May your heart stay open and your voice stay true. May you see clearly and touch peace and know deep in the quiet center of yourself that you are whole. Thanks for watching. See you next time.